Keith.
My lady, this afternoon's witness is Professor Sir Jonathan Van-Tam.
I swear by Almighty God.
I swear by Almighty God
That the evidence I shall give.
that the evidence I shall give
Shall be the truth.
shall be the truth,
The whole truth.
the whole truth,
And nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Professor, and I'm going to call you Professor rather than Sir Jonathan,
Of course.
if that's acceptable. Could I ask you to give your full name, please?
Yes, my name is Jonathan Stafford Van-Tam.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you for attending today. We appreciate that you've been made to wait a very considerable amount of time. Thank you also for the provision of your witness statement dated the 8th of September 2023. There it is. All the contents, the full contents of your statement will, of course, be considered. It is a significant and substantial statement running to 146 pages. You are, by profession, an epidemiologist, a physician specializing in public health, mainly communicable disease control. Have you spent most of your academic career engaged scientifically on issues of epidemiology, prevention and control of respiratory virus infections and the like?
Yes, I have. I started my academic career, I guess, in about 1991 and very quickly gravitated to the study of respiratory virus infections, but notably influenza, which has been the dominant public health threat from respiratory viruses for a very long time. And I found this area stimulating and stayed in that area all of my career.
And as a result, Professor, are you the senior editor of the textbook Introduction to Pandemic Influenza? Have you published more than 200 peer-reviewed scientific papers, and you hold a plethora of degrees, diplomas, doctorates, fellowships and honorary fellowships?
That's correct.
All right. In terms of the positions that you've held, were you head of the Pandemic Influenza Office at the Health Protection Agency Centre for Infections between 2004 and 2007?
Yes.
You were, and you have been for a long time now, a member of you were a member of what was then the SPI committee. You were a member of SAGE during the swine flu pandemic, is that
Yes.
correct? And were you the chair of NerveTag from its inception in 2014? For how long were you the chair?
So NerveTag actually was the kind of successor to SPI. So it wasn't entirely a new committee, it was more kind of reformatted. But from its inception, which I believe was about 2014, through until the time when I became DCMO, at that point I clearly could not continue in NerveTag, which has to be a committee that is independent of government.
And then in October 17, did you become the Deputy Chief Medical Officer, particularly concerned with health protection?
That is correct.
Presumably your portfolio has always been, and was while you were DCMO, a broad one.
Yes, it's really covered all the infectious diseases, threats, bioterrorism and biosecurity. So very broad, and in the time that I have been in post, it's pulled in other emergencies such as the Novichok attacks, the monkeypox crisis, and various other things, but also including some kind of pharmaceutical pieces, for example, the shortage of EpiPens.
Then in March 2022, did you relinquish your position as DCMO and then turn exclusively to the world of academia?
Yes, I did. It was a planned move out of government. I was a full-time academic for another year, and I'm now part-time 1 day a week at the University of Nottingham and self-employed for the other 4 days.
I'd like to ask you, please, firstly, some questions about the role of the DCMO and with particular regard to the fact that you are the DCMO concerned primarily with health protection. Is the role of DCMO and the role of DCMO for health protection functionally independent from government? Are you allowed to say what you want within reason and to express your professional views?
So the answer to that is in several parts. Yes, absolutely. As a subordinate of the Chief Medical Officer, then I've been given the permissions of that office to be independent of government, and feel it depends on your Chief Medical Officer, of course, to a large extent, but feel that Sir Chris gave me very much a partnership of equals, gave me the opportunity and respected my professional experience, and gave me the opportunity to speak independently. That having been said, I do not think it would be right, and I'm a traditionalist who understands the chain of command very strictly. I do not think it would be right for a DCMO under any circumstances, other than the serious illness or death of the Chief Medical Officer, to start making comments that were particularly strategic or particularly wide-ranging in terms of their implications across government without a full and frank discussion. And the normal practice would be for that discussion to happen and then the Chief Medical Officer to make remarks on behalf of our office. Occasionally it would be delegated.
So in that sense, Professor, you are accountable to the Chief Medical Officer. And is that why you say in your statement that you wouldn't issue a piece of advice, for example, to a core decision maker without first satisfying yourself that it was in line with the Chief Medical Officer's own views?
Yes, it would depend on the subject. So, for example, if it was something quite technical on the aerobiology of respiratory viruses and droplet distances and aerosols, then of course I would just, kind of crack on with giving the advice in the interests of speed and efficiency of government. But if it was something notable or significant, it would only be right for me to channel that through the Chief Medical Officer.
The evidence shows very plainly that during the initial weeks of the crisis, so particularly between January and March of 2020, you took the lead by virtue of your role as DCMO for health protection on the initial phase of the response to the pandemic. How did that come about?
Yes, so that is basically business as usual within the Chief Medical Officer's office. We would not have expected Sir Chris to track all of the infectious disease happenings around the world. That would fall to me and whichever private secretary was looking after me. It would fall to me to make the liaisons with Public Health England and with the wider health protection community, for example, CDC in Atlanta. And then at a certain stage, if this was something more than the routine or the trivial, to then start to have a conversation with the CMO about that. So it came about because it was routine, I think is the answer.
Give us, please, also a broad idea of what your important position at that time comprised. You presumably gave a great deal of advice regularly to the Secretary of State in the Department of Health and Social Care, to DHSE junior ministers and to the DHSE itself. Presumably, you also were asked to respond to requests for advice from central government, from the Prime Minister and other ministers, and from officials in the central government machine, if I may call it that.
So the answer
is that a fair summary?
The answer to that is really in two parts. In kind of peacetime, the DCMO's role would be to, for example, observe the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation, observe NERVTAG, work closely with policy officials looking after vaccine and health protection policy, look after global public health with that policy official team. But the amount of contact with the Cabinet Office and with Number 10 and other government departments would be relatively sparing at that point. That, of course, changed as the magnitude of the SARS-CoV-2 crisis unfolded in front of us. But in normal times, there would be not that much contact at all, but that changed over time.
Were you, for example, regularly attending Number 10 Downing Street and therefore present in many of the decision-making meetings which took place there, or was that something that was ordinarily left to the Chief Medical Officer?
I can't recall that I ever went to number 10 Downing Street before the pandemic started, and I can't recall going to Downing Street for a meeting other than the 5 p.m. press conferences. I may have got that wrong. There may have been one or two occasions when I went to a number 10 meeting, but really my contact with number 10 was very constrained and related to those press conferences. So I really wasn't in much of the discussion that I know you've been asking other witnesses about. The other thing I kind of want to say is that quite early on in the crisis, although, as you rightly point out, in those early days, I was really quite significantly involved in the kind of alerting. Once the kind of machinery of government, SAGE, COBRA had started to move, then one of the other things that I moved to very quickly, partly in conjunction with the government chief scientific advisor, Sir Patrick, was getting ready and building up the momentum for the vaccine task force. And of course that started quite early officially in April, and it really became the very dominant part of my work for, I would say, the rest of my time in government. So whilst I was involved in many of the things you've talked about with other witnesses, it was pretty peripheral in relation to their roles, and I was beginning to really focus very hard on getting vaccines for the UK as fast as possible.
You may have been attractively modest about the extent of your role, Professor, because the evidence makes plain that you were seen as a source of expert advice, in particular as well on technical aspects of virus transmission, and you were hugely concerned not just with vaccines but with the development of therapeutics.
Yes.
And all the issues that surround those two important areas.
Yes.
Is that fair?
That's very fair.
All right. In terms of the significant structural bodies of which we've had a great deal of evidence, COBRA, COVID-S, COVID-O, Four Nations meetings, were you regularly in attendance at those meetings, or were they fairly infrequent?
Yeah. So let me go through those. COBRA would be really one where my presence would be required only when Sir Chris was not available or had specifically delegated that I go to it. I can't think of an occasion when Chris said, "I'm not going, you go." But I can think of at least one occasion where he was unavailable. I may have been in the outer room at COBRA, not participating but observing on one or two occasions, because of course, you know, these are things that don't happen very often, and there's a lot of learning for somebody who's still relatively junior in government as a DCMO to kind of learn stuff from observing in COBRA.
All right. COVID-S?
Next one, COVID-S.
COVID-S, COVID-O?
I don't recall being in many COVID-S meetings. They're the ones designated S because of the presence of ministers. I have lost count of the number of COVID-O meetings that I've been into. There could be several every day at one point or another. And really, you know, you lose track of this. You're so tired and you're so overwhelmed by the workload, you literally go from one meeting to another, wherever your diary manager sends you next.
The evidence shows that you also attended a very significant number of SAGEs.
Yes.
In particular, you were present on the SAGE 18 meeting of Monday, the 23rd of March, about which I'll be asking you questions. Is that a fair summary?
That's fair. May I make a little comment about SAGE?
Please.
So I think the primary purpose of SAGE was for the government to garner a range of scientific opinions from independent experts, which, to my mind, it did very effectively. But and who knows, you know, in another time, another world, I might have been on SAGE by virtue of being a professor at the University of Nottingham. However, I was on SAGE partly, of course, for my scientific knowledge and advice, but I was still a DCMO. My boss, Sir Chris, was co-chair of SAGE, and it was important that those independent scientific voices were in the room rather more than a kind of, replay of the Chief Medical Officer Office opinion. So I would say that whilst I was certainly on Sage, and I don't dispute any of the dates you could pull forwards about when I attended, I would say that my role was relatively muted, although I would say what I needed to say.
Whilst on the subject of SAGE, Professor, you refer in your statement, or you use these words in your statement, that SAGE was strongly influenced by biomathematical modelers.
Yes.
What did you mean by that?
I meant that their information in terms of providing reasonable trajectories and possibilities for what could happen as the epidemic waves of the pandemic played out, I felt that was really important, and I thought they had really unique skill sets. Now, the context to that, and it's very important, is that I can only think of 3 people who served on SAGE in 2009 during the swine flu pandemic, and again on SAGE this time, and that was Professor Ferguson, Professor Edmonds, and myself. So over that period, I had come to learn and understand and trust the outputs from the modelling groups. I was very reassured that actually what came to the table was a kind of consensus from multiple different modelling groups working independently across the country, Warwick included. And that's why I make that point in my statement.
In truth, I wasn't asking you to express your views on the validity or worth of modelling or their work. It's only that the use of words such as SAGE was strongly influenced by biomathematical modellers might suggest that you were making an observation there about the relative lack of influence of other disciplines, perhaps infection control experts or community health control experts or public health clinicians, as opposed to the modellers.
I wasn't making that
That's
difference.
not the point you were making. All right. And then finally, did you attend most NerveTag meetings?
Well, I attended most NerveTag meetings at the beginning when NerveTag were kind of synthesising the pretty limited data coming out of China and then a few other countries in Southeast Asia. As I said earlier, once the momentum of my vaccines work built up, it became more and more difficult to just be in 2 places at once. And I literally had to kind of send a private secretary to sit in on the NerveTag meeting, or indeed just get the readout afterwards. It wasn't that I wasn't following what NerveTag was saying, but I couldn't physically be there to shepherd every single item as time went on.
Professor, I want to ask you about a sensitive matter which you've raised in your statement concerning the demands, the unprecedented workload that was placed upon you, and the consequence of what you describe as extremely hateful messages received by you from the public, by email, some of which has led to the police becoming involved.
Yeah.
Did you, as a result of the unprecedented demands placed upon you, but also on account of these hateful messages, consider your position at any time?
Yes. So let me begin by thanking the vast, vast, vast majority of the public who, when I meet them, are just supportive and grateful. And I deeply appreciate that. The workload was horrendous for all of us at the beginning. It certainly was in the kind of 16 hours a day mark, and it certainly was 7 days a week. It was very, very intense. Where I think it finally got to me was the fact that I might have expected that if a crisis happened, this was my responsibility to bear that kind of workload. I did not expect my family to be threatened with having their throats cut. I did not expect the police to have to say, will you move out in the middle of the night, in the middle of the evening, will you move out for a few days while we look at this and potentially make some arrests? We didn't move out because of the cat, as it happened. We didn't want to leave the cat. But it was a very stressful time indeed. And, my family didn't sign up for that. And I only make this point because I'm so worried that if there's a future crisis, people will not want to sign up for these roles and these jobs because of the implications that come with them.
If I may speak on part of myself, thank you for bringing that to the inquiry's attention. Moving on to two final preliminary subjects. Your statement refers to the close collaboration throughout the pandemic between the Office of the Chief Medical Officer and the counterparts in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, and considerable amount of evidence has been heard about how at the medical level, the CMO, OCMO, DCMO level, there was extensive collaboration. Do you consider that degree of collaboration, of cooperation between the devolved administrations was appropriate and that it worked well in the face of the unprecedented demands of this pandemic?
So clearly this was a virus like most others that doesn't respect international borders, doesn't respect where you live in the UK to any great extent. And I felt that the medical colleagues in the devolved administrations had very much become my friends by the end of the experience, which is probably the kind of quickest way to give you some sense of how close and how bonded we felt as a group of professionals battling with the same kind of common cause in mind. So, yeah, I think that worked very well.
Was there also extensive cooperation with and collaboration with your international peers and colleagues throughout the course of the pandemic?
Yeah, well, one of the advantages of having been in the influenza world for 30 plus years is that you've met a lot of people and they've stayed with you in their territories throughout all of their careers as well. So you have a lot of contacts to pull on. And I had a lot of international contacts and people overseas who I call professional friends. And I'd done really quite extensive work with CDC in the past in the US and had really quite strong links with Singapore. But I think my statement gives you a list of all the different countries with which we've engaged.
There are very many. Now, the timeline, and focusing on the first few weeks of the emerging pandemic, I don't wish to go through all the very many emails that you sent and received, or the many meetings and conversations that you had with your colleagues within the Office of the Chief Medical Officer about the emerging pandemic. But just to pick up some of the high points, if we could have 151286, you forwarded to your colleague, Professor Sir Chris Whitty and others, important information that you had received by way of a forwarded email attaching what is called a ProMed digest. We've had evidence about ProMed. Was this a summary of information that ProMed had put out?
Yes, I mean, that's right. I've just forwarded it straight on. And if you click on the link, you would find that there's a little bit more short paragraph of what the report was coming in from China about this cluster of undiagnosed and slightly peculiar pneumonias. Now, personally, it's very clear, and I forwarded that ProMed email. I think I had probably heard something a couple of days before that. I was at home on leave at the time, so this would be, pretty much my first day back at work. It didn't add information that isn't in the kind of ProMed text, but it was really around the cusp of the new year that this started to emerge. And it's common for me, if I see something that I think, ooh, yes, I just want to watch this a little bit more carefully, to forward that to my health protection policy colleagues, not to kind of get them terribly excited at that point. And as I pointed out, there's a caveat. It's a bit like a football transfer website. There's lots of rumours and half-truths on it. But just flagging it, that this is something I am going to watch over the next few days, not something that I'm asking them to watch, merely just register that it's there.
And three brief points, if I may. Firstly, the evidence appears to suggest that ProMed is a valuable and consistent source of important information. It does very valuable work, and professionals such as yourself around the world rely to some extent on ProMed's work.
It's informal. There's a lot of noise in there, but I think it's valuable.
Secondly, this email quite plainly shows that you're already reaching out to your professional colleagues around the world, and other emails show
Yes.
all the ways in which you reached out to other countries. This one happens to refer to the US. But is this a good indication of how speedily and effectively this system of international collaboration works?
I think it is, and it's also, I guess, on this particular email, an illustration of my, networks, having run a WHO collaborating centre for influenza from Nottingham, and my understanding of NerveTag and the fact that Dr. De Brera from PHE, referred to as Gavin in the email, actually tracks viruses for NerveTag and produces risk assessments on an ongoing basis.
The material shows that you forwarded this email and you also started other email chains with colleagues at the World Health Organization as well as the CDC and with other colleagues around the world.
Yes.
Thirdly, in relation to this email, you've used the word emerge, information about an emerging virus in the course of your evidence. Subsequently, it became apparent, of course, that there had been cases in China.
Yep.
Genomic research has indicated that there had been cases in China for some time.
Yep.
Can we just make plain, or can you just make plain that this was the emergence, at least insofar as you were concerned and the United Kingdom was concerned,
Yes.
of this novel coronavirus? But that, of course, doesn't mean to say that there hadn't been a coronavirus circulating in China for some time.
You're quite right, and you've picked me up on the word emerge, and I think that's a really good one, and thank you for doing that. I probably shouldn't have used the word emerge, because I think I'm kind of back transferring the fact that it was an emergent respiratory virus. This could have been a chemical pneumonitis. It could have been a cluster of
chemical
pneumonitis. It could have been a cluster of Legionella cases that was within a few days going to be very rapidly explained as something terribly ordinary. So you're right. And on the point about kind of the genomic sequencing, I'm not an expert in this area, but I gather that it is perfectly possible, according to the sequencing data, if you kind of back model it, that this virus might have emerged sooner than this report.
On the 8th of January, 151293, having received information from the CDC, that's to say the Institute in the United States, you sent an email to your colleagues saying, I'd picked up a whisper from CDC that it was thinking novel, non-SARS, non-MERS coronavirus. This is what Professors of Chris Whitty and myself felt was most likely. And then in the penultimate paragraph, you say, good that there remains no known person-to-person transmission.
Yes.
Briefly, did you make that reference to person-to-person transmission? Because one of the most vital pieces of information in the early stages of responding to a possible epidemic or pandemic is to know the nature of the transmission between people and whether or not, of course, it's sustainable.
Yes, absolutely. And just to qualify, good that there remains no known person-to-person transmission doesn't mean there is none. It means that there are no credible sources or descriptions of person-to-person transmission on the date the email was written.
Yes. 9th of January, 236466. On pages 2 to 3, in the middle of an email string, you say in the first paragraph in your email to Chris Whitty, notably 0 reported case fatalities so far, though 7 of 59 cases with severe disease is a significantly high 12% case hospitalisation rate. In my view, such that established person-to-person transmission would cause serious hospital surge pressures on a par with severe pan-flu virus. So, without going into all the many issues or questions that sentence gives rise to, can I just focus on the significantly high 12% case hospitalisation rate? It's not possible, is it, to know from the number of people who are hospitalised or who may die from a pathogenic outbreak, the full extent of the outbreak, because that doesn't tell you how many people have got mild symptoms or no symptoms, and therefore constitute the body of the iceberg.
Correct. Yeah, and all we can go on at this point and be very clear about is that these are very small numbers. These are 59 cases. We don't know what the level of case ascertainment is in total, but in a kind of worst case scenario, if these were genuinely the 59 cases, then 12% of them requiring hospital care is not insignificant.
It tells you a lot about the possible severity of the virus, and it indicates something, because if you've got a large number of hospitalizations, a large proportion of those people infected in confirmed cases hospitalized, something about the possible degree of transmissibility.
It could do. It doesn't really tell you anything about transmissibility. It tells you about severity.
All right.
And it is caveated very clearly on the very small numbers, 7 out of 59, which, if you worked out the 95% confidence interval on that 12%, it would be pretty wide based on a total denominator of 59. So, but the audience I'm talking to, possibly the top epidemiologist in the country, will know this and will understand what I'm saying through that.
And there's a reference then in the second paragraph to R3 triggers. Is that a reference to the triggers to which, in fact, Sir Chris Whitty spoke?
Yes.
Being triggers revolving around whether or not transmissibility extends to be up to family level, the degree of transmissibility, to the possibility of healthcare workers becoming infected and falling ill, and also to geographical spread.
Yes.
Are those the triggers?
Yes, indeed. And I think Chris was very clear yesterday about his kind of concerns that maybe triggers wasn't quite the right word, but we all use words sometimes in the heat of a crisis that we don't mean. And I don't think he was saying that there were specific triggers for anything beyond heightened concern. However that's defined, it's difficult to say.
On the 13th of January, you attended a NervTag meeting as an observer, according to your statement. The minutes are 23107. An important part of this meeting, if we look at page 6, it is the issue of risk. The current PHE risk assessment for this virus was presented, and then there's a number of elements.
Yes.
And the conclusion which NervTag reaches. Could you just confirm your understanding of what is meant by this risk assessment? Is it an assessment of the risk at that point, or is it a prospective assessment, a contingent assessment of the future?
It's an assessment of the risk at that point based upon the extant data at that point as available to PHE. I think this is a good moment for me to try and contribute to the inquiry in a way that makes the future better for the UK than the past. And one of the things that I think where the risk assessment system has failed us is that whilst it may be extremely accurate, and I'm absolutely not calling into question the judgment of any of my PHE or wider health protection colleagues about the risk assessment, the problem is that it relates to the current moment, and that unfortunately, when you then try and say, well, what does it mean for the future, you get into massive uncertainty, and that's part of the problem, possibly why it's never been done. But equally, it doesn't give any kind of flavour to the less experienced reader about what the range of possibilities kind of is in the future, if you like. And I think that's really difficult because, NervTag is tracking new and emerging respiratory virus infections and, often keeps them on the radar because they have some degree of pandemic potential. And so you could almost say that everything's got the possibility of inflating into a big crisis at some point. So it is difficult, and it will be very nuanced to do it, but I think it's very unfortunate that this can be read as, oh, well, it's low, just forget about it.
And of course, an important part of any risk assessment process is the message that is communicated thereby.
But just to come back on the risk assessments, NervTag was very rigorous about these being dynamic, and with every NervTag meeting, anything that was on the risk assessment chart, as it were, Dr. De Brera would update with the latest information. It was quite a job for him to keep on top of it all, but he did a great job.
Now, if we scroll back out and go to page 8, paragraph 5.8, we can see a reference to port of entry screening. Port of entry screening was, I think, a matter for DHSC. Is that correct?
I think it was in the beginning.
Yes. NervTag noted that the body of scientific evidence and previous experiences indicated that port of entry screening has very low efficacy and the benefits very unlikely to outweigh the substantial effort, cost and disruption.
Yes.
The issue of screening, the issue of more stringent restrictions at borders, the issue of closure, quarantine, whatever it might be, screening or restriction, came back to NervTag and to you, indeed, and to others repeatedly, because, of course, it was an issue that was revisited throughout January, February, March. Was there any real change, however, in the response of yourself, NervTag, and those opining on this subject, in terms of recognising the very limited epidemiological advantages of border controls and also the very significant practical difficulties?
I recall that the science advice on port of entry screening has been fairly consistent all the way through, that it's pretty inefficient. And it just boils down to the length of a flight, shall we say, for argument's sake, from Hong Kong versus the incubation period of a typical respiratory virus. If you are infected in Hong Kong just before you board the flight, I can absolutely guarantee you'll be asymptomatic and you'll be PCR negative for respiratory viruses when you get off the plane at Heathrow. You'll become ill, if you're going to become ill, several days later when you're nicely ensconced back in your domestic setting in the UK. That is the principle of why it only picks up a really tiny fraction of the cases that might enter that way.
On the 14th of January, on the 15th of January, you advised your DHSC colleagues on the subject of person-to-person transmission, 151316. And on page 1, you said, in the third paragraph, for now, we do have person-to-person transmission by the sound of it, but it does feel from the statement made like H5N1 in 2004, when we did see person-to-person transmission that was largely limited to really close contacts, and where the length of the chains of transmission were short, suggesting inefficient transmissibility between humans. Was this an important moment because it was you informing your colleagues that you'd answered the question you posed in the earlier email, which is there person-to-person transmission?
Yes, but extremely limited. As a virus that is essentially from another species, when it first encounters humans, and if it can cross the species barrier at all, then you get very occasional incursions into humans that can cause very severe disease in the tiny, tiny minority of exposures, or the tiny, tiny number of circumstances in which there is an exposure. The next, and I'm not a virologist, so you might want a virologist on the stand at some point, but the next kind of evolutionary step of a virus is to adapt to its new host, and in the process of that, it may become more transmissible in its new host. But it won't just go from can't transmit to fully transmissible in one step. It will take this kind of interim step. I don't want to give it a kind of consciousness and a being, but it will take that kind of interim step to be inefficient but capable of person-to-person transmission. And I think that's what this report refers to. And as you know, we've had inefficient transmission person-to-person of H5N1, avian influenza, for several decades now, in fact since 1997 on and off. And that virus has not produced a pandemic. So this is not an interpretable signal that, that Armageddon is about to happen.
Nevertheless, your statement, Professor, states that on the 16th of January, you first became seriously concerned about the threat that this virus potentially posed to the United Kingdom.
Yes.
And you say this: by that date, it was clear that this was a novel coronavirus. It was fairly clear that human-to-human transmission was occurring. And my view was that this would be a significant pandemic. And before you answer, elsewhere in your statement, you use similar words, but you emphasise that we would experience a severe pandemic in the United Kingdom.
Yep.
So may I just ask you, firstly, what did you mean by would? Did you mean we might, we may, or we will, or something in between?
Okay, let me just answer that particular point there. When I wrote the word would, I can't put myself back, in that time and say what was I thinking when I wrote would, but I think I was saying on the balance of probabilities, my instincts were telling me that this was going to cause us real trouble and be a pandemic. Now, the piece of information that you've put up on the screen, that's still on my screen, relates to information from the World Health Organization. But of course, my instincts are based on things a lot more wider than that. They're based upon looking at the news and seeing, just the kind of footage from Wuhan province, Wuhan city, and starting to think this doesn't look or feel like something that is a small cluster. It's also based on the fact that, I have 30 years experience of communicable disease control, and have often been the one in the office who's been kind of picked out because of my specialist interest to deal with outbreaks of respiratory viruses. And so this is all very soft, but it was my instinct, and I think it's right to report that, to you that my instincts were telling me, and I'm sure I had that conversation at home, that we were in for a bad time.
To make plain, Professor, the degree of, or the certainty or lack of it, or the degree to which you took this view, you say in your statement, I absolutely understood in my mind's eye that it was a matter of when, not if, things would progress.
In my mind's eye, yes.
So,
yeah, absolutely. That doesn't mean at that point that I felt that all the data were in place to prove my point or the instinct. And I think that's something that you explored with Sir Chris yesterday.
yes, indeed.
And I'd like to come back to that if that's all right.
I'm going to ask you about that in a moment. And just on those words, my second question in relation to that sentence was, when you say there would be a severe pandemic, although not there but elsewhere, you refer to in the United Kingdom, is it self-evident that by pandemic you meant a pandemic impacting upon the United Kingdom?
I did, yes.
Yes.
A pandemic is a worldwide epidemic
Right.
of something novel, usually.
why were you not confident, or putting it the other way around, why were you concerned that the virus would not be restricted to China, that if it left China, it would come to Western Europe and to the United Kingdom, and that if it reached the United Kingdom, it would not be controlled, all of which are necessary steps in the conclusion there would be instinctively a pandemic, you believed, in the United Kingdom, and it would be very, very bad.
I just know how notoriously difficult to control respiratory viruses are. I knew this by this stage appeared to be a novel coronavirus. I knew the diagnostics would not be necessarily sophisticated or upscaled anywhere in the world at this point. And just my general experience told me that I didn't like the look or feel of this.
Now, indeed, you're right. You said in your statement that you of course spoke to Professor Sir Chris Whitty about this, the CMO, you're the DCMO, and your statement records that his response had been to agree that the situation may well escalate, but for now we needed to wait and monitor developments closely. Now, before you answer, I just need to put to you something else, another point you make in your statement, which is that in the extremely difficult and complex field of being an epidemiologist, when confronted with information suggesting the spread of a viral pandemic, there is, you describe a spectrum of ways in which you can respond. And there are people who act on instinct more. Perhaps there are people who like to pause and wait and accumulate data. And that's how you've put in your statement. May we take it that both your positions, your more instinctive one, perhaps Professor Sir Chris Whitty's desire to accumulate more information and wait and see, both fall within that spectrum of reasonable response?
Well, that's right. You get a range of opinions on science. You get a range of opinions on when the data are certain enough to tell you what you're seeing. And then you have to overlay on top of that personalities. And, you know, much as Chris and I are great friends and, you know, very dear colleagues, and I genuinely mean that, we are different personalities, and we both say we're different personalities. You know, I'm the one who chases the ball. Chris is the one who would look at the ball first and make a more qualified and thoughtful decision about whether it was worth chasing. So from that perspective, we are...
He's right, if I may say so.
Second?
I think he's right.
Yeah. So, you know, there is that difference, and I understood entirely that I was conveying my instincts at that point. But I think Sir Chris was entirely right, given his much more profound experience of government, that, you know, he knew when to press buttons that I didn't. In any case, I was subordinate to Chris, and I respect the chain of command. So I was perfectly content with the response that I received. And, you know, it wouldn't have been possible to kind of wake up Sage and wake up Cobra, because I was getting a bit excited about something based on instinct. And there weren't a lot of data at that point. That position changed, of course, very quickly indeed. And it was 6 days, and the data were changing daily at that point, but it was only 6 days before Sage was enacted for the first time, and it was only 8 days before Cobra was enacted. So I feel the system was kind of at that point beginning to kind of work, if you like.
May we leave it on this basis, Professor? Your instinct appears, if I may say so, to have been more of an epidemiological instinct. It was an instinctive response to the data, such as it was, and it was very limited, about the transmissibility and the nature of this pathogenic outbreak.
Yeah.
But Sir Christopher's position, perhaps reflective of his position as the CMO, paid greater weight towards the consequences of pressing the alarm bell, how quickly the government could be made to respond and made to sit up and take notice and to treat this issue seriously.
Yeah, so
that's the divide.
You're absolutely right. I don't think Sir Chris was remotely tardy, but I do think he was doing his job as the CMO, which is different to my job as the DCMO, which is more of the kind of sentinel alerting role.
Well, and to be fair to Chris too, I mean, you're not going to get any government to move on the basis of Professor Van-Tam's instincts, are you?
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I didn't expect it. I was just, we have a very open office. We don't, we say what we think. We talk to each other as professional colleagues, and Chris has made that very clear that we professionally, that's how we should be. And so it's a safe space to say, look, I've got a bad feeling about this.
And did you say earlier you were involved in the swine flu
Yes.
response? Wasn't the Chief Medical Officer at that stage criticised for pressing a warning button too soon or too much? I can't remember. Was there some?
I don't recall that, but I just don't recall it. I couldn't comment.
Evidence has been received from other scientists and epidemiologists to this effect. Because of the characteristics of a viral pathogenic outbreak, viruses can explode, they can move extremely fast. There is a premium on speed of reaction, because once you get behind the response curve, you can find yourself very quickly in very deep trouble. To what extent should an instinctive response, and you're an expert epidemiologist, have been allowed to push the system further forward, or to push it further forward than it was, given the nature of the field in which you practice, dealing with a deadly viral pandemic?
Well, you're kind of right in that there, things can get out of control with respiratory viruses very fast, but it does depend upon the doubling time. And the doubling time for some viruses is very low. Not particularly respiratory viruses, but the doubling time for some viruses is low. The doubling time, in the end, when we had quality data for SARS-CoV-2, was certainly in the range of sometimes 5 days, sometimes 10, but that's the kind of broad range of doubling times. So, yes, there's a point about moving fast, but you've got to understand the doubling time before you can know just how much of a hurry you're in, and we couldn't do that at this point. Right. There's a secondary point that I think is really important for the inquiry globally in terms of the interpretation of data, in terms of what was coming in from the surveillance system and when and how people acted. If you receive data that shows an increase in infections, then you're actually receiving data on human behaviours that occurred, roughly speaking, 7 days ago. And you have a question mark about what happened in the interim 7 days. If you receive data on hospitalisations and they look a bit kind of a bit fruity, then you're actually receiving data on exposures to the virus that occurred probably 10 to 14 days ago. Because we know with SARS-CoV-2, you're not admitted to hospital the moment you get SARS-CoV-2. You're admitted when you become breathless, 5 or 7 or even 10 days later.
And this is why it is so vital with viral pandemics, viral pathogenic outbreaks, not to fall behind the curve.
But it's also why you're always working with one hand behind your back, tied behind your back, because the data you're receiving on cases and hospitalisations pertain to exposures that aren't, by that point, historical.
There is always a time lag in the information.
Indeed.
That is absolutely required to be able to react.
And I wanted to land that point, so thank you for that.
In your statement, you say elsewhere that moving on now, and the government machine having been woken up, and numerous COBRA and SAGE and NervTag meetings having taken place, by February half term, you believe you understood that the virus had actually been present in the United Kingdom for several weeks before that. Now, evidence has been received by the inquiry to the effect that indeed there were hundreds, perhaps many more, seedings in the United Kingdom.
Yes.
Throughout the February half term. So in a broad sense, you were, if I may say so, absolutely right. But by the middle of February, what view, if any, had you reached, the alarm having been raised, as to the speed with which the government machine as a whole was responding? And I want you to answer that both by reference to the plans for countermeasures or plans for border controls or hand washing or school closures or whatever it might be, and also control. Was there a sufficient understanding of the practical limitations of control measures? Sir Chris Whitty has said he was under no illusions that control measures would by and large be effective because there was no test and trace, scaled up test and trace system. So were you concerned by mid-February at the speed of process, the speed of progress of the government, or were you content with the reaction?
Look, the data were getting worse with each passing SAGE meeting, and I think the minutes of the SAGE meeting speak to them for themselves on that. The situation was not improving in terms of the data that NervTag were looking at. I knew that SAGE was properly engaged by this point. I knew that the outputs of SAGE were feeding into central government. I didn't really have any sight or visibility of what was going on at that level. I'm afraid I can't really answer the question more than I have.
No, it is very helpful. Do we take it, therefore, that you weren't privy, for example, to the plans coming out of the Civil Contingency Secretariat on the 28th of February, or the debate on countermeasures in SAGE on the 24th of February? Those weren't matters with which you were concerned.
I can't recall which SAGEs I was in or not, but if I was in a SAGE, then I would a part of a SAGE because I had other meetings as well. But I will have been witness to those, but I certainly wasn't present when those kind of discussions were taken back in to Cabinet Office or Number 10 to understand, what their kind of official and political response was starting to be.
Having reached the view that you've expressed on the 16th of January, and having reached the view that you've expressed in relation to the extent of the sustained community transmission of the virus by mid-February, did you reach a view as to the timeliness or not, absolutely open-ended, the timeliness or not of the countermeasures that did in due course come to be imposed? So the measures of the 12th of March, the 16th of March and the 20th of March.
So it won't really surprise you that I'm pretty aligned with Sir Chris on this. My kind of instinct reaction was not a day too soon. With the benefit of hindsight, I think I reflect that these measures would have all been better, kind of certainly 7 days earlier than they were, possibly a little longer than that. So somewhere in the kind of 7 to 14 day window, that would have been perhaps a bit more timely.
And is that a reference to all the countermeasures, so those on the 12th and then the 16th and the 20th, and then ultimately, of course, the lockdown 23rd? So they could all have been applied a bit earlier.
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right.
Yeah, I think that's fair. But particularly, the move into lockdown. But I do appreciate that there were things going on the weekend before which made the data look suddenly much worse than they had previously looked. So I think, there was an element of a change there that really kind of galvanised hearts and minds.
But not a change that, in fact, sweeps away your observation or your assessment that it could all have been earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
If you had any of the measures short of the mandatory lockdown imposed earlier in the 7 to 14 days, in your expert opinion, was there a chance we could have avoided the mandatory lockdown, or is it impossible to say?
I think it's largely impossible to say, but I think for me, the balance of probabilities, looking at just how infectious this virus was proving to be in places like Italy, France, that that there were just almost certainly no alternatives. And my view, I don't know if you're going to come to it, but I'll just say it anyway. My view is that although there have been lots of expressions about the NHS overwhelmed, that was possible, overtopping, overwhelming, etc. My view is that we would, as is the same as Sir Chris, that we would have first run out of high intensity care beds, and it is possible within a couple of weeks, if we had not acted when we did, that we would have reached in a position where the number of people requiring admission with COVID, severe enough to warrant hospital care, could not have been admitted, with some, pretty awful potential considerations at that point.
Since you've gone there, we've gone slightly out of the chronology, but that's no bad thing, Professor. Could I ask you to look at a SAGE meeting of the 23rd of March, of course, the date that the mandatory stay-at-home order was imposed, 129072, because in fact you were present at that SAGE. You may or may not recall 129072, and at paragraph 7, these words appear. Or rather, perhaps let's start at 6. The NHS is surging bed capacity over the next fortnight with a focus on London. The data suggests that London is 1 to 2 weeks ahead of the rest of the United Kingdom on the epidemic curve. Case numbers in London could exceed NHS capacity within the next 10 days on the current trajectory.
Yes.
Firstly, that last assessment could exceed NHS capacity. Was that premised upon no further lockdown or no further stringent measures being imposed, and therefore reliance upon the measures from the previous week, that's to say the 16th and 20th, or case numbers could exceed even if we do impose the mandatory stay-at-home order? Do you know?
Yes, so I don't know, but the way I interpreted it for sure was that if the current rate of growth continues, case numbers could exceed NHS capacity. Now, NHS capacity has to be something that is a little bit fluid in terms of regions. London was ahead of the curve. I don't doubt that if London was full, for want of a better word, there would then be an overflow of London patients into other parts of the NHS, because that's what we do. And that's particularly what intensive care units do as a matter of kind of routine practice. And that has implications for places not in London and further out of the city who are behind the curve, who essentially, because people don't go into intensive care and come out the next day, they certainly weren't doing at this point, that has implications for kind of whether the remaining capacity in the regions, for want of a better word, and I'm quite sensitive about this because I live in the regions, I don't live in London, what that does to the remaining capacity. So exceed NHS capacity is possibly a slightly loose term because you can kind of sleep out by region, but it still has implications for the totality of the NHS bed capability.
The material around this time uses, as you've already identified, a number of different ways of describing the impact on the NHS. Overwhelming, overtopping,
Yep.
exceeding capacity, straining the surge capacity, and so on and so forth. Is this the position, as you understood it at that SAGE meeting? There was no hard data saying there is a stop point, a hard date by which the NHS will be broken, but that instead, if the epidemiological trajectory or curve continues in the way that it has, it will inevitably be broken at some indeterminate point in the future. Is that the nub of it?
Yeah, so hard stop's a really kind of bad expression for the reasons I've given, that, you know, if you're short of capacity in one area, you kind of move out and ship out and sleep out into the other areas. But you know, the NHS is nevertheless finite in the number of staff and the number of beds, and so I think that's right. I think that's the
correct
yes.
analysis.
You did say something else, and I've forgotten it.
No, I think that was all I said.
Okay.
And secondly, obviously on that 23rd of March, only a few days had passed since the measures had been imposed the previous week.
Yes.
On the 16th and then the 20th. The household isolation, the individual isolation, then the household isolation, then the request that all non-essential businesses and travel stop, and that people endeavour to stay at home. What was your understanding of what the likely impact of those measures was in terms of the R figure? Because as Sir Christopher has explained it, it's not that government was grappling with absolute data as to when or how the NHS would collapse. It is just that if the reproduction figure was not brought below 1, the exponential growth would continue, and that point would inevitably be reached. What debate was there about giving more time for the measures the week before, time to bed in, and for the R1 to cut the R figure to come down, in the expectation or hope that it would come down before that future date of collapse of the NHS would be reached?
Well, if you enact measures on, say, the 20th of the month, then you if everybody complies with the measures on that date, you change exposures from that date. You therefore change case incidence, shall we say 5 to 7 days later, something like that. So you don't see the impact of that. You then don't see the impact of those new cases for another 7 days until they require hospital care. So that kind of takes us into quite a way into the next month. And by the exhibit you've just put up, the doubling time for intensive care unit patients at this point was estimated to be 3 to 4 days. So how can you wait to see the results of those measures when you're in such a kind of difficult position in terms of bed number doubling?
There was nevertheless some way of assessing compliance or the reaction to or the response to those earlier existing measures, because there was some information at the weekend about levels of compliance. And you recall the fact that the press and the television showed large numbers of people attending national parks over that weekend. So there was data about that. Is therefore the position that the quandary the government was in this, nobody could say for sure what the impact had been or would be of the existing measures. No one could know for sure because, as you say, it would take days, if not weeks, for the impact to become clear. What, therefore, the impact would be, and that was an unconscionable risk to run. If you don't know what the beneficial impact had been of the week before, you cannot continue on the basis that you've just got to hope it will work, given the characteristics of the viral pandemic.
So I understand the question entirely. What I don't think I can do is give you the kind of technical answer you require, which I think the modellers would need to give you about what their views were about the likelihood of those phase 1 measures, if that's the right word, having the desired impact. I wasn't close enough to it at that point.
I don't wish you to speak on behalf of the modellers.
No, and I can't really give you an answer then.
But was this not a debate that was taking place within SAGE on that day? How do we weigh up the prospect that the phase 1 measures are going to work to get us out of the hole against the risk that if we don't act now with further more stringent measures, it'll be too late? That's the crisis. That's the dichotomy.
Yeah, I've pledged to be truthful, and I will, and I can't remember.
All right. Can I now raise just some other separate, disparate areas? The Coronavirus Action Plan of the 3rd of March.
Yes.
Did you have a hand, Professor, in its drafting or its promulgation?
I undoubtedly received a copy of it to make some kind of track changes and suggestions to. In fact, I think if you were able to kind of look at the email records, you'd probably see that that was the case. It was another job to do. I was rather more focused on specific jobs I had to do connected with fighting the virus than writing a glossy pamphlet about how I was going to play my role in it, or how the government was going to do it. So I'll be perfectly truthful with you. It was another job that probably wasn't very welcome at the time, and I just thought, well, see it through.
May I ask
Let others do it.
May I ask you this? You've told us how you'd already reached the view in mid-February that
Yep.
there was sustained community transmission, essentially containment had been lost. You must have wondered around about the 2nd of March when you were contributing to the final draft, why am I assisting in the drafting of a document which is based on the premise that containment has not yet been lost, and indeed the government didn't announce it was lost until the 12th of March.
The drafting of government documents takes forever and a day, and it wasn't really something that I was focused on or really had the kind of mental and professional energy to worry about.
All right.
I've written down action. I was focusing on actions, not plans, not words.
Yes, I was, I'm afraid. Yes.
Well, that perhaps is a very useful description of certain publications. Milady, is that a convenient point?
It is, certainly. We take a 15-minute break, Professor, so I shall return at 3:25.
All right.
But we shall complete your evidence today, I promise.
Professor, mass gatherings.
Yes.
I detect a quiet groan. It was an issue upon which you advised the Secretary of State for the Department for Culture, Media and Sport in late February. And you also provided advice to DHSE colleagues at the same time. You met with officials in the DCMS in early March. You provided further advice and further papers for a number of government departments in the middle of March, 14th of March. So you were to a considerable extent the go-to person on this issue. In summary, scientifically, epidemiologically, was there a consistent line of advice given by the OCMO to the effect that banning mass gatherings or closing sporting events or sporting occasions would be unlikely to make much of a difference epidemiologically?
Yes. I mean, our position, my position, has always been that mass gatherings, particularly outdoor ones, are if you cancel them, they're a very limited epidemiological effect. And if you take into account the kind of pathways around them, it is the activities around them that is, potentially more concerning in relation to kind of pubs, bars, restaurants, etc. But even so, in relation, for example, to, I know you've already discussed a couple of big sporting events in different countries with various witnesses. In terms of the kind of totality of movement between countries, the effect of kind of cancellation of these events is really epidemiologically quite small. I have also heard Sir Chris's comments, and I have to say I think he's got a very valid point that there is a political layer above this around the optics and what the continuation of mass gatherings signifies to the public, because when the football's over, there's not much left to do in life, as it were. So from that perspective,
Well, I have to interrupt you there, Professor. That is your personal view.
Yes, indeed. Yes, but the point is, it's very symbolic for a lot of people what these math gatherings are. And I think Chris summarised it very well. I don't think I can add to that.
Can I just ask you one extra question for that? I think it's something Mr. Weatherby was asking about earlier. And that is, but what if your football match involves a whole bunch, thousands of people flying in from another country where there is a hotspot of infection? Or hotspots of infection?
So that partly depends on whether there are lots of other people coming in through kind of routine tourism and so forth from that other country. And it really depends upon whether you have a belief that the virus is already seeded here in the UK, and whether that additional movement would really be an amplification in relation to what is already going on under the surface in your own country, particularly in those kind of early months when we know we couldn't test at the capacity required to understand the UK case burden.
I'm no scientist, but aren't you just raising the risk? It's not going to help matters?
I think it's perfectly fair to say that it won't help matters, but equally, it isn't going to it just isn't going to have a significant negative impact either in relation to the totality of what else is going on. So it's back to this point that I think it's always very difficult in this space to separate out the optics from the actual epidemiological effects. But I can recall emails from other experts. I think Professor Ferguson and Professor Edmonds also agreeing that the effect of mass gatherings is
Professor
very slight.
Ferguson, in fact, was asked to advise specifically on this point, and we've seen the evidence.
Yeah.
But just to conclude this subject, Professor, when you say political and you refer to the optics, do you mean, in fact, that in terms of the public health message that went out, the continuation of mass sporting events was, with hindsight, ill-advised? It just sent the wrong message.
It was unhelpful.
You can't talk about closing primary schools and allow sporting events to continue, can you?
It was unhelpful.
All right. And then, secondly, just on the epidemiological side, that there's some suggestion in the material that whilst it's clear that outdoor sporting events epidemiologically are insignificant because they're outdoor, there may have been an underestimate of the epidemiological consequences of queuing to get into games, or perhaps using public transport or the use of trains. And as my lady has observed, that's one way perhaps in which people may be coming together to go to a game, and therefore there was an epidemiological risk there, which perhaps wasn't fully appreciated at the time this advice was given.
Whenever you get people gathering together in conditions of close contact, low ventilation, with this virus, you're likely to get transmission. The however many tens of thousands one could get into a stadium will be dwarfed by the however many millions that are gathering in pubs to watch it on Sky TV. So, there's a broader context here of what the sporting event generates in terms of people coming together, quite often to drink alcohol, which we know reduces social barriers, to observe a sporting event.
Indeed. The easing of restrictions.
Yes.
On the 26th of May, you contributed to a joint letter to Simon Case, the then permanent secretary in number 10. Could we have 69418?
Yes.
In essence, in general terms, you and your colleagues were writing to the government to say this. You're aware that different government departments are eager to restart their industries. You're obviously acutely aware of the damage and harm that is being done to the health and welfare of societies by virtue of the restrictions. But you nevertheless felt it important enough to warn that the combined effect of seemingly incremental and narrow easings raised essentially an intolerable risk that the R reproduction number would run out of control again. Why was it necessary to write this letter as opposed to just continue to contribute to the sum of government learning by the advices that you were giving with your colleagues day in, day out at meetings, by email and so on and so forth?
Yeah, okay. So the actual restriction, the easing of restrictions that was happening on a piecemeal basis, government by government, department, kind of setting by setting by setting, and it was relatively easy to justify for an individual setting that this was kind of okay to ease restrictions. There when you put all of those together, there was a risk. Your words were intolerable, they're not mine, but there was a risk that this would all go too fast.
Well, you say severe risk, if I may observe, of a second.
Intolerable's not a word I don't think I use.
All right. Well, a fair word.
But there was a risk that this would all go too fast. And there was a risk that we knew there would be further waves of infection. Epidemiologists knew that at some point. There was a risk that if you kind of let it go, let it kind of rebuild and get a lot of momentum, you would then enter the next wave from a fairly high level and therefore have less warning and therefore with more consequences. So that was the kind of science reasoning behind the letter. Why the letter rather than just continuing to cooperate? And I think that was about, certainly for me, and I can only speak for my signature on the letter, I wanted to leave a mark in the sand here.
Why was it necessary to leave a mark in the sand if you were, as you were, of course, the DCMO, giving advice on a daily basis to government with your colleagues?
Because people like you have come back to it now, and it's kind of on record that I was concerned enough to write a formal letter to the CABSEC at this point because of those concerns that I've already relayed to you in the room.
But they were concerns that you would have been ordinarily expressing in the course of your day-to-day meetings, because all of you were exclusively concerned, of course, with the pandemic and with the easing of restrictions and the debate that was going on.
But sometimes a letter is needed.
Why was it needed?
As I said, to lay down a trail in writing that was incontrovertible, that we wanted to say that this needed to be taken very carefely.
If
that suggests you didn't think your oral advice was being taken sufficiently seriously.
I think it could partly suggest that, but it could also partly reflect the kind of fragmentation of decisions across different sectors, and therefore possibly the CABSEC, not being an epidemiologist that I'm aware of, not being able to crystallise the net result of those individual sector liftings and frame that in terms of the national epidemiology. So, I don't think it was because we kind of felt we'd run out of road in terms of, getting traction with officials from other government departments, not at all. But I just think it was more about the totality and somebody who's responsible for the totality actually being presented with that concern.
Professor, it is common ground, it's well established that as these things go, the level of prevalence remained relatively high, or at least not very low, throughout the course of the summer months. We came out of the restrictions with the prevalence still at a relatively significant level, and that didn't change. Then in September, there was a debate, which we're not going to go into, about the necessity for circuit breakers, then the introduction, or instead of a tier system in October, and then ultimately the lockdown in the beginning of November.
Yeah.
In general terms, do you assess that this warning, which is what it surely was, because the last paragraph shows what might happen if control is lost, was generally heeded?
You know, I suppose the epidemiology really just speaks for itself at this point.
But could you tell us, please?
Yeah, you know, it was clear that we were losing control of the virus bit by bit through the autumn again, and it was clear that the tier system, to my mind, was not working efficiently. That isn't to say that theoretically it couldn't have worked efficiently, but there were just too many delays in implementing tiered restrictions. Those on top of the fact that your data you're dealing with, again, and I go back to the point, reflect exposures 2 weeks before, or at least a week before. So, you know, you're already kind of, you know, dealing with yesterday's data, trying to make decisions. So, and the tier system just seemed interminably slow between a decision and the negotiation on the economic packages to enable it to happen. And
Can we just focus on that for a moment? And,
Yeah.
and could you just further explain that observation? The evidence is that in the October tier system, not the December one, but in the October one, there was a process by which local authorities who were subject to higher levels of tiering could
Yeah.
negotiate financial packages.
I believe so, yes.
Was your concern that there was a delay built into the system between the moment at which the joint biosecurity, the joint biocentre would advise that a particular area had to go epidemiologically into a higher tier,
Yep.
to the point at which it was actually ordered because there had to be a process of negotiation in the middle?
Yes.
All right. And then because of your point about the importance of not falling behind the curve and not knowing what the data in fact shows because the data is
Yeah.
a bit old, that gave rise to a very real problem.
Yeah, and the tier system led to some other problems too. For example, Liverpool did really well at one point and managed to kind of significantly to kind of turn their numbers down. Manchester got into more difficulty, but there were widespread reports of you know, people from Manchester going to nightclubs in Liverpool to circumnavigate the kind of geographical boundary of the tiers. So at a practical level, I think it was very difficult to kind of make it work, and it probably looked better than it really was, which is why I just don't think the tier system served us very well at all.
You focused on the events in October, Professor. My question, in fact, was designed to elicit from you an answer as to the general governmental response from the time at which you sent the letter in May. Was the reality that the warning was not heeded to this extent? Control of the disease was lost. The steps taken by government in September, by way of the decision not to impose a circuit breaker, the decision in October to have the tier system that you've described, failed to do that very, failed to perform the very aim, the strategy which you had identified as being necessary to ensure that there wasn't a new loss of control and a new second wave.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, thank you. Eat out to help out.
Yes.
Did you, Professor, were you consulted on that scheme? We've asked the same question as Sir Patrick Vallance and Sir Chris Whitty. Were you involved in that?
Absolutely not. The first I heard about it was Think on the TV.
I think that indicates what view you would have taken had you been consulted.
Say again?
What view would you have taken had you been consulted?
So, had I been consulted, I wouldn't have made any distinction between Eat Out to Help Out and any other epidemiological event that brought different households into close contact with each other for the purposes of socialising, eating and consuming alcohol. The net epidemiological effect, is kind of agnostic to what's on the menu, as it were. But I would have said this is exactly encouraging what we've been trying to suppress and get on top of in the last few months. So it didn't feel sensible to me.
All right. Finally, two last subjects. Moonshot.
Yes.
You were on the Moonshot Scientific Advisory Group.
Yes.
The first meeting of which took place on the 25th of August. We've heard very little about the moonshot. What was, briefly, the moonshot idea or exercise?
So I'll give you my best understanding of it, which may not be perfect. The understanding of moonshot was to try and restore the UK to a point where we had almost no COVID. And to do that, to detect every single case there was kind of cooking or ongoing in the UK at the same time.
A mass test.
So mass population testing in a very short window of time. Now, I never got to the point where I understood whether this could be done in one day or done in 3 days, but even 3 days would be, 20 million people a day. And so I never really kind of understood that concept. But it didn't make any epidemiological sense to me, because let us say that your testing day was Monday. Yeah.
For a whole swathe of the population.
For a whole
region.
group of people, yeah. And there would be a number of people who were exposed to the virus on the Sunday, who absolutely would test negative on the Monday because they were incubating the organism, who would get a kind of clear result, as it were, by Tuesday or Wednesday, but who, by Thursday, may well have symptoms. So actually, you would have to repeat this over several days and keep people in isolation from each other to avoid further exposure, to kind of get to the point where everyone was clear. And I just couldn't see it working. I was sent to the Moonshot meeting. I can't remember who sent me, but I was told to go on to the Moonshot meeting. And I went along. I tried to offer some non-negative, constructive comments, but I couldn't see it working ever.
That's the epidemiological answer. Practically, as at that time in August, do you recall whether or not the United Kingdom in fact had a fully scaled up system of PCR, antigen or free flow tests that would have allowed these sorts of numbers to be tested simultaneously?
I mean that's a memory test, and I can't remember the figures, but my kind of gut feel is no. And of course, there were other far more important testing environments, such as hospitals and care homes.
Indeed. Finally, communications. In your statement, you refer to the fact that there was a Japanese poster called the 3 Cs: closed spaces, crowded places, and close contact setting. The merits of which commended themselves to you, and you sent a copy of that poster to the Cabinet Office in mid-June. So not during the lockdown and not save the NHS time, but afterwards. No. Why did you send a copy of that poster to the Cabinet Office in mid-June?
Well, I can't remember when I first discovered the existence of the Japanese 3 Cs concept, but it immediately resonated with me. And, all I can say is it resonated with me personally, because I felt it would be a way, if we did it right, by which we could coach the public to look at any situation and just, remember 3 Cs. It's pretty simple. Literally, is it closed? Corollary, and what's the ventilation like? Is it crowded? Are you putting a lot of people into that closed space? And is the purpose of them being there to have close contact with each other? And I felt that you could teach people to self-regulate almost and risk manage their own behaviours, their own exposures, if we could kind of make that concept work in the UK. And
Had it been very successful in Japan?
I can't give you the answer to that. All I can say is, repeat what you said to me, that it absolutely resonated with me.
All right. You sent it to the Cabinet Office. You were told that it would be considered. This type of messaging it would be explored as to how it could be integrated into the campaign. Did you hear any more?
No.
You were the DCMO for health protection in the face of this pandemic.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you very much.
Mr. Weatherby.
Professor, I ask questions on behalf of the COVID bereaved Families for Justice United Kingdom. Represents many bereaved families across the United Kingdom. And for the purposes of the questions I'm going to ask you, it's important to record that some of them are bereaved of healthcare workers, and some of them themselves were healthcare workers during the pandemic, including on COVID wards. Now, on the 9th of January, you attended, so very, very early in the story, you attended a PHE strategic response group where it was agreed that COVID would be treated as a high consequence infectious disease, HCID, although I think it was formally classified as such a few days later. Is that right?
Yeah.
And
I think it's right.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I have the document. I'm happy to put it up, but I'm trying to work at pace. The minute of that meeting, I'll give the reference for the record. It's 119453, and the minute records that it was recognised that COVID, like SARS, was a virus with, quote, higher airborne transmissibility. And that would mean, wouldn't it, that it was recognised that it was transmitted either by aerosol or droplet transmission. Is that right?
So higher airborne transmissibility does mean that it could be transmitted via the airborne route, which includes large droplets and also includes fine particles, also referred to as aerosols.
Thank you.
But aerosol or airborne transmission is not part of the definition of a high consequence infectious disease.
Thank you for that clarification. I wasn't, in fact, suggesting it was.
No,
but that's what was recorded in the discussion, during which it was agreed between you and the PHE group that it would be, in fact, classified as a high consequence infectious.
And the reason for that classification at that point was that primarily, I think at that point we really did not understand with any certainty the infection or case fatality rate. We didn't know how lethal this virus was. And the HCID classification is used for things which you know are very lethal, and used for things where you have uncertainty as to the lethality.
Yes.
It's the way you kind of start with a new organism.
Indeed. And in fact, the document goes on to say that it was agreed to follow a, quote, safety first principle, which is, I think, what you've just helpfully explained to us. In fact, the discussion and the classification at that stage was then added to by guidance. And again, I'll read it rather than put it on screen if I may, but I can if you want me to. It's 184034, and for the record, it's paragraph 4.3. And the guidance on the 15th of January that was issued with respect to this.
Could I have that up?
Yes, of course.
That's all right.
Yeah. Could we have that up then, please? I'll repeat the. It's 184034. Right. Sorry, can we just have the first page up first, just so we can orientate us as to what it is? Thank you. So it's the Wuhan novel coronavirus infection prevention and control guidance, 15th of January.
Yes.
So can we go to the paragraph that you helpfully had already been put up. Thank you. 4.3. Page before, I think, yeah, 4.3. So what was required was, firstly, an isolation room with negative pressure relative to the surrounding areas, or a neutral pressure single room. And then a use, specifically set out use of an FFP3 respirator by all persons entering the room. And then, I won't go through it, but you can see it there. Full PPE. Yeah.
Yep.
So that's what was.
And this is guidance issued by Public Health England.
Yeah.
Yes.
But this is sensible precautions for this type of virus, isn't it?
It's sensible and pretty standard precautions for HCIDs at this point in time.
Okay. So then move to the 21st of January, and again, I think we should have this up. It's 151342. And this is an email exchange between yourself and a PHE official. It's been redacted, so I don't know who it is, but it doesn't matter. But it's an email exchange. And the person confirms that there's no agreed requirement to stop calling it a disease an HCID in order for confirmed cases to be managed outside of HCID centres. Management in specific HCID treatment centres is deliberately not part of the agreed definition for criteria for HCID. We do have a line in guidance saying confirmed cases should be transferred to HCID treatment centres, but that could easily be changed when an agreed surge trigger is met. And then this. Personally, I would want to maintain the HCID label if it became more widespread, to maintain appropriate IPC, infection prevention control precautions, and general levels of clinical concern awareness around the new disease, as long as we still think it meets the stated criteria. Yeah. So what that means in summary is that you're agreeing with the PHE official that once the spread of the virus reaches a particular point, it's not required that that patients should be within an HCID centre. Now,
not quite true. I think what I was flagging, that the HCID process, if you like, and the use of those very high security beds, there was a step down, and a known step down, to the 500 or so infectious disease beds, which again have enhanced infection control, but that there was no provision or understanding about what happened when you got to the end of those 500 beds.
Okay.
And it was very clear that we were going to get to there quite quickly.
Okay, well, can I take this in stages?
Yeah.
So the HCID scheme, if I can put it that way, is that there's a standing capacity of high isolation beds.
Yes.
So if there's a need for isolation, the HCID patient is put in there. But it's well recognised that if there's more than a small number of such patients, then that can't
It just
apply.
can't function.
And so it's completely impracticable to have a standing capacity of thousands of empty beds.
Indeed.
So it starts off with an HCID unit, small number of beds, and then if that isn't sufficient, you then have to open it up, and you move on to the high dependency unit capacity, or whatever you have, and you have to use practical means to expand the capacity to the best isolation that you can manage within the capacity that you have. Is that right?
Yeah, that seems okay.
Yeah, okay. But what is being said here is that although that is fine, what should be maintained are the IPC precautions around that.
Yeah. So that was personally my view.
Yeah.
The other factor that was later, I was later made aware of, that is that specimen handling and the whole process of treating patients under kind of HCID rules means that your total capacity is lower and your speed of movement and handling of specimens particularly is lower and more cumbersome. And the classification of HCIDs lies with the Advisory Committee for Dangerous Pathogens.
I'm coming to that.
Good.
So the point is that it's recognised that you have to be flexible about capacity, and therefore the HCID classification allows for a surge, a trigger, which opens up the capacity, and you have to do the best you can with the capacity.
So I don't think it allows for it in the sense of it has always allowed for it.
Yeah.
I think this was new thinking.
Okay.
I think this was a new situation.
The guidance we've just been to sets out the need for the isolation units, but not in terms of specifically HCID units. But it does specifically refer to the FFP3s and the particular requirements of personal protection for the staff. And that's the distinction I'm drawing. So that's whether it's the HCID guidance or not, that's the guidance that was in place here, which I've just taken you to.
Okay.
Yes?
I'm all right. I'm all right so far.
Yeah. So by the beginning of March, as we heard from Professor Whitty this morning, there was then a question right at the beginning of March about the biosafety requirements of dealing with samples in labs.
Yep.
So perfectly sensibly, the CMO, the office of the CMO, then consulted with PHE and the HSE and got the biosafety requirements stepped down so that the testing could be maintained, or the analysis of the testing. Yes?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah. And then we moved to the 3rd of March. And again, I'm trying to go at some speed here, so please stay with me. But then a DHSC official messaged that the standing capacity for airborne HCIDs had been exceeded, and therefore there was this outward movement from the very high isolation capacity outwards. Now that, you probably won't remember the date, but that was the 3rd of March. I can take you to the document, but I don't think it's necessary. But were you aware at this sort of time, the beginning of March, of that happening? In accordance with what we've just been through in
I can't remember the date, but I entirely expected that we could not continue to manage a very fast-growing epidemic of hospitalised patients on the infectious diseases network, within the infectious diseases network.
But this was what we've just been through, the 21st of January email. The expectation was that if this did become widespread, that this would be necessary. And here we are at the beginning of March. It has been necessary. The plan, such as it was, it wasn't unexpected.
No, I think I kind of flagged that there was probably a gap in the plans that didn't kind of bridge between what we classically envisaged HCIDs to be handling, such as Ebola cases, to something that was then becoming a persistent, and widespread infection. But let me just add a little bit to that, where the threat of infection to others was changing over time, so it was not exclusively about the healthcare environment, and it was starting to be more about the general community environment. In other words, the opportunities for exposure to the virus were starting to change. Whereas, if you have, you can have the infectious diseases unit, the HCID, full of Ebola cases, but there's no risk in the wider community.
Okay.
It's contained. This was very materially different.
Yes. Okay. So I'm now moving on to the final part of where I'm headed with this, and that's the 13th of March, and NervTag met, and I think we need this up. It's 212195.
Oh, thank you.
And that's the 13th of March, and if we could And this is a meeting where the HCID classification is considered. And just to remind ourselves, this is where we're in the crisis phase, the exponential rise in COVID cases, okay? So if we could move to page 4, please, and paragraph 2.5. And this refers to, this is relevant to you, action JVT. And then JVT noted that guidance was needed to help relieve pressure points on the NHS in England. And then there's the example of ambulances. Yes?
Yes.
And then if we move on to 2.9, please. The new guidance that's been proposed is then stepping down from FFP3 proper respirators to the kind of blue surgical masks that many of us are familiar with,
Yes.
having gone through it. So a real step down in PPE for people who are dealing with COVID patients at that point, at the crisis stage. And then, if I may, 2.10, there's a recommendation there that the reclassification of COVID from a HCID is considered by the advisory committee, which you were referring to earlier. And then finally, on this document 211, please, there's an update where you'd spoken to Professor Evans, who had advised that HCID status was discussed, and the committee were unanimous in supporting the declassification of HCID. Now, just to complete the picture, well, first of all, you've therefore got the recommendation that it's reconsidered, and then you've got effectively a decision in the next paragraph referred to, which suggests that the decision has already been taken. Can you help us with that?
No, I don't think that's the case at all.
Have I misread that?
Well, I mean, clearly they're sequential minutes, but the minutes aren't written the moment a NERVTAG meeting is finished. I don't suppose we have the publication date on these minutes, do we?
I'm not aware of that.
No, we just don't.
Okay.
But that will be worth looking into.
Yes.
But likely, having received an instruction from one independent advisory body in the shape of NERVTAG, who were requesting that ACDP looked at this, likely I moved very fast on that.
Yes.
And likely this should have been reported as an action point that I had done really quickly. And this was almost a kind of post-meeting note that was the consequence. Okay. I just can't spread any further light on that. No. But I refute the suggestion that this was a fait accompli.
Yes.
I'm extremely fastidious about appropriate procedure. And if NERVTAG had asked for that, I would have asked ACDP in due course. Yep. This would not be kind of retro-constructed, as you might have been suggesting.
Right. Well, I'm exploring rather than suggesting, but the one paragraph says
it does.
A recommendation, effectively, and the next one refers to what's effectively a decision. And the reason that you were, however it lands, the reason that you were in touch with the professor about this is because they were effectively the decision-making body.
ACDP, absolutely, yes. Yeah. And it would be worth possibly seeking some supplementary evidence from the ACDP minutes to understand exactly how that happened.
It may not matter, but I was then just going to take the one final document, which is 119498, which is the 16th of March document at the top, although it does say the 19th of March at the bottom. It probably doesn't matter, but just to orientate us in terms of the date. But this is the Four Nations HCID definition and list group, chaired by the head of emerging infections. And I won't take you through it, but this is ostensibly a review of the HCID position and then changes the position at the end of the document. And of importance here is that this is a 4 nations group. So this is where the 4 nations are brought together. So in terms of this, first, I've got 2 points on this just to finish with. But who's actually making the decision here? Is it the professor from the group that you were in touch with on the 13th? Or is it the 4 nations group? Were the 4 nations CMOs involved in this? I mean, what was the process here?
I am pretty certain, but I can't answer the question about whether the HCID definitions group was a subgroup of ACDP, but clearly my instruction was to contact ACDP, and it may well be that this is some kind of subgroup of ACDP, but the participants are from the public health agencies, Public Health England, Health Protection Scotland, Public Health Wales, and Public Health Agency of Northern Ireland, and therefore Cora. And I can't tell you who they were.
But the 2 dates, the 13th and the 16th, it does seem by the time this review has taken place, the decision's already been taken.
Look, I can't give you. I just can't give you any clarity on that. If I could, I would.
Final point. The upshot of this is that right at the crisis point, the classification of COVID is being downplayed. And one of the key points, perhaps the key point here, is that healthcare workers, there's now no requirement for them to have respirators. The requirement is for them to have simple surgical masks. Why is it that that happens in the eye of the storm, when the cases are going exponentially and healthcare workers are at the highest risk? Why is that happening now?
There wasn't the clearest understanding at that stage that there was that fine droplet transmission was dominant, and I can only surmise that the people who wrote the guidance, Public Health England, felt that the predominant route of infections was droplet, and therefore a surgical face mask was adequate. But I can't give you a better answer than that.
Well, I mean, you were involved in these discussions, but let me just put this to you. Was this decision to reduce the protection for healthcare workers because there simply weren't enough FFP3 respirators?
Not by me.
Thank you.
Mr. Witherby, I appreciate you've been trying to stick to your time, and I'm very grateful. Did you want to ask the question about why did it take so long for medical masks to be recommended?
I wasn't going to go there, but thank you.
Thank you. Right, I think it's now 7.
Good afternoon, Professor.
Afternoon.
I represent the COVID-19 bereaved Families for Justice Cymru, and I just have 5 minutes, so I'll take it quickly if I may. Just one topic from myself, and that is in relation to the 4 meetings convened by Mr Gove in his capacity as Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, and your perspective on how useful they were to a 4 nations approach to handling the pandemic. We understand from your witness statement that you attended some of these meetings. So if I can take it in a staged approach, please.
Yeah, okay.
We understand they started around May 2020. That's the evidence we have.
I'll have to go with that. I can't tell you.
And in terms of the purpose of these meetings, you say in your witness statement, ma'am, this is paragraph 5.12, that they were chaired by Mr Gove, and the purpose was to exchange information and to coordinate across the devolved administrations. So it would seem from that explanation that you're not suggesting to this inquiry that Mr Gove was using these meetings to gather views from the devolved administrations to inform UK government decision making. That was not the purpose. Is that correct?
No, not really. It was a much kind of, it was a softer exchange of views. I think really mainly by the the ministers who were on that call about kind of what was happening and literally exchange of views and information. And I was there in the room, really, in case there was a technical question.
I'll come on in a minute to some specific examples of what may and may not have been said and jog your memory if I may.
Okay, yeah, of course.
Just on purpose, before we move on to that, was it also your understanding at the time that another purpose of Mr Gove's meetings was essentially to insulate the Prime Minister, the then Prime Minister Mr Johnson, from having to deal with the devolved administrations because, as we know, he thought it was optically wrong for him to have regular meetings with them? Was that your understanding at the time?
Whew, I have no idea. I can't answer that question at all. I didn't enter the meetings with that kind of degree of allegiance to.
Well, was that ever discussed in your presence?
CDL.
Was that ever discussed in your presence?
No.
This is the purpose of the meeting.
Absolutely not. No.
So on usefulness, you say in your witness statement that you did witness effective communication between core decision makers and the devolved administrations, and you cite an example of the meetings with Mr Gove. And I think that there probably isn't any dispute between the First Minister of Wales, in particular Mr Drakeford, and I think it's fair to say Nicola Sturgeon. They both acknowledge to this inquiry that the meetings were helpful and constructive. However, I do want to just probe your memory on a few criticisms that, in particular, Mr Drakeford has ventilated to the inquiry about the effectiveness and indeed the overall usefulness of these meetings. And really it's to understand whether you heard any of these complaints being raised in this forum. But can I check first, do you remember now being in meetings with Mr Gove and Mr Drakeford?
I definitely recall Miss Sturgeon being present. I'm pretty sure Mr Drakeford was present too at some points, but it's just a blur to me.
It's just a blur. But just thinking about how many you attended, I think you say in your statement that largely it was you that attended.
Yes, it was.
Okay. So these are some of the concerns or complaints that Mr Drakeford has given to the inquiry, and I want to ask you if each one or any of them,
If any of them,
you heard him saying that, or indeed any member of the DA saying that. So the first one is this. There was a lack, or the meetings were ad hoc, and there was a lack of formal structure to when they happened. Did you hear that complaint?
No, and somewhere in my dim and distant memory, I recall these were Wednesdays at either 5 p.m. or 6 p.m. They weren't a terribly sociable time, in terms of family life. And I do, somewhere I think I'm recalling that they were Wednesdays.
Okay. Next one, please. That there was a concern, and it might be fair to say that this was held quite strongly by Mr Drakeford, that these meetings, whilst helpful, were no substitute for high-level ministerial meetings. Did you hear that complaint?
Nothing heard.
And this is a very important one because it might be suggested that this goes to the issue of whether or not there was a coherent Four Nations approach. And this is that the clarity of messaging was a challenge for all Four Nations, and that more unanimity would be helpful, and that could only happen if the UK government gave more notice of its decisions and announcements to the devolved governments. Now that features regularly in written communication, certainly between the DAs and Mr Gove. Did you hear that complaint?
I did not hear that. As a slightly broader sentiment, I think I heard that there was some frustration about the timing of communication. Equally, I do recall on a couple of occasions that Scotland went first on a couple of points.
But certainly I think what you're suggesting is some of the concern was coming from the devolved administrations that the UK government was perhaps making decisions and briefing the press without telling them first.
It doesn't sound like a totally strange concept, but I don't recall it from those meetings. I really don't.
And so finally then, did you hear any complaint from any member of the devolved administrations, including Wales, at these meetings about communications?
I was there in a technical capacity, and the answer is I can't recall, but I don't think so.
Okay, thank you very much. Those are my questions.
Thank you, Ms Heaven. Sir Jacob, last again.
Okay.
Don't worry, Professor. Mr Jacob's used to people having turned their back on him. He doesn't take offence, but you have to keep your voice to the microphone. That's why I'm afraid he's used to it. We're not being rude to him.
Professor, I can be, I think, very short as it happens. My questions are on the same topic as the questions I directed to you, your colleague, Professor Whitty, this morning, namely financial support for self-isolation.
Yeah.
Could I actually just start with this? Do you agree with Professor Whitty's evidence of earlier today as to the importance of financial support for self-isolation?
I think it was, very easy, or relatively easy, for people in well-paid jobs with very good employers who would allow them to self-isolate and who could continue to do their work in a kind of isolated way in the home. But I think it was enormously difficult for people who were not fortunate enough in our society to have those kind of jobs, who had jobs where it was, kind of essential to earn money to actually be out of the house. And I think this was an essential part of the package.
Professor, my lady, if you don't mind me going a very tiny bit off script, I will be very short. Professor Whitty referred to heated debate within government on the issue. Is that something that you were party, or is that really his preserve, given his particular involvement in meetings in Downing Street and so on?
The package of support handed down to people who had to self-isolate, who were, for example, self-employed, was just kind of way above my pay grade.
Fine. Can I just ask this then? Was this issue on the importance of financial support something that was foreseeable prior to the onset of the pandemic? And I have in mind your own sort of research and expertise. Prior.
I think in influenza pandemic planning, and if you go back to influenza pandemic exercises undertaken by the government, the concept of school closures was pretty well rehearsed, to the extent that anything is ever rehearsed through a short exercise. But I think the kind of society-wide kind of lockdown and social distancing measures, particularly ones that were then applied multiple times during the pandemic in total to kind of put the brakes on each time. I think that was just way beyond anything that had ever been planned, and therefore. And most of those exercises were about kind of technical issues related to antivirals, vaccines, health service responses. I'm not aware of any response on any rehearsal or concept of economic support being aired widely before this.
Yeah, that's helpful to understand. I had in mind something slightly narrower.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You refer in your statement to a 2017 article that you, I think, co-authored about influenza, I think in that specific context in care homes.
Yes.
And you referred in that article, didn't you, to care home workers being a group that, given their low pay and insecure work, were at high risk of working while sick.
Yes.
So in that sense, is it right that the link between insecure work, prevalence of working while sick, was something that was understood really from the outset of the pandemic? I
think it was quite narrowly understood in the context of care home workers, and in the context of that being a very historically low pay sector. And in particular, there's a point there you didn't mention about the care home worker who works in 2 or 3 different care homes because they can get a shift here, a shift there, and together, by going to 3 different homes in a week, that makes up the family income. And of course, that's kind of epidemiologically not a good idea when there's a respiratory virus circulating widely across the community.
Thank you, Professor. I think that may be an issue taken up with other witnesses as well. Thank you, my lady.
Thank you, Mr. Jacobs.
My lady, may I detain you just for one moment, which is that although he's not made a rule application, Mr. Friedman, King's Counsel, has asked very nicely whether or not, based upon something that Professor Sir Jonathan Van-Tam has said in his statement, we would refer back to that article and just elicit a single point, which may mean we needn't put it to Professor Jenny Harris next week. Professor, in that 2017 article, did you and your co-authors warn, in fact, of the potentially devastating consequences of explosive outbreaks in care homes in the context of runaway viral infection?
I guess we did, in as much that we looked at the literature and we understood the mortality rate that is possible when an infectious virus gets into a very vulnerable population who live essentially quite close quarters to each other. The literature was all about influenza rather than SARS-CoV-2, so there are differences there. But that these were vulnerable populations, extremely vulnerable populations, I think has been known for a very long while. And I personally have dealt over the years, and I can't quite give you the details, as a registrar in public health, with a number of really difficult to control explosive outbreaks of influenza in care home settings, nursing or care home settings.
Thank you.
That concludes the evidence for today. Thank you very much indeed, Professor Van-Tam. I don't know if you heard what I said to Chris Whitty in Module 1, but in relation to the abuse and threats that you described earlier, I've come across that kind of extraordinarily awful behaviour in another context, and I know the impact it can have upon the recipients, the victims, and the victims' families, even if they don't receive threats, which by the sounds of it, yours may have done. It's just too awful to contemplate. I just want you to be reminded, you probably don't need reminding, but just in case you do, the vast majority of the population abhor such conduct, and we are enormously grateful to you and your colleagues for the way in which you served the public of this country, of the whole of the United Kingdom, in a time of national emergency. So please ignore the violent, criminal, idiot element, and remember the rest of us are grateful. Thank you. Sorry, I'm losing my voice.
Milady, thank you.
9:30 tomorrow.
All rise.